In this lesson, we will begin learning about the different types of inputs that are at our disposal when we are creating forms. In an earlier lesson, we learned about the input type of text. So if I save and refresh in my browser, you can see a basic text input. But there's an old saying that when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. So while the text input definitely has its place, it's not the right choice for every type of field. So let's imagine that we're creating a form and we want to collect the user's email address. There's a special type for that. So let's set up a standard form. We'll use the form element. Let's move our input to sit inside the form element. And you'll remember that we want to have a label associated with any fields. So label, email. We need to associate the label with the input, so we'll give the label a for attribute of email. We'll give this input an ID of email. Now this is the important part. For type, instead of text, we can actually include email. And then let's go ahead and also give the input a name of email. And finally, let's give this form a submit button. Input type equals submit, value equals save. So if I save and refresh, we can see here is a form. It's labeled. If I click on the label, it automatically puts my cursor in this field. Now if I type something that is not an email address and click save, most modern web browsers will automatically try to validate the form data. So you can see in Firefox, it's telling me, please enter an email address. This means that if we would have used text as the input type, the form would have gladly submitted with this value in this field. But because we used a type of email, the form knows that there needs to be an email address in this field or it won't accept the form submission. Another advantage of using the email input type is that it greatly enhances the user experience for touchscreen users. So if someone's using a touchscreen device and they tap on this field, the on-screen keyboard that displays should include the @ symbol in a fairly prominent location because it knows that this is an email input and you're going to need the @ symbol. So if we contrast that with the on-screen keyboard that is displayed if this was a text field, you might need to click a symbols button to toggle a different on-screen keyboard layout in order to find that symbol. So in other words, by choosing the correct input type for your field, you're making the lives of touchscreen users a bit simpler. Now, email isn't the only special input type. Let's take a quick look at another one. Let's imagine that we wanted to collect a user's telephone number with our form. So we will include input with a type of tel for telephone. Let's go ahead and give this input a label, telephone. Give it a for attribute with a value of telephone. Give the input an ID that matches that, telephone. And finally, let's give this input a name of telephone. So now if I save and refresh in my browser, we won't see anything special because I'm using a desktop or laptop computer. But if we were using a touchscreen device, when we tap on this field, the on-screen keyboard would resemble that of when you're dialing a telephone number. So it would be very easy to enter a phone number. Now, in an effort to keep this lesson from becoming very repetitive, I'm not going to go through every single input type in front of you. We've seen email, we've seen tel for telephone. If you're creating a form and it feels like there really should be a special type for that input, odds are there is. So in the course materials for this lesson, I will include a more exhaustive list of all of the different input types. But for now, let's move on to something a bit different. Up until this point, the only type of field that we've seen is a text box about this size that can receive a single line of input. Well, what if we want to allow our users to type an entire paragraph? There's a different field for that. So let's erase this field. And let's create a field where our users can type a message. Instead of input, there's an element named text area. And unlike input, we want to be sure to include the closing tag for text area. So let's go ahead and create a label for our text area. Your message. Give the label a for attribute with a value of your message. We'll give the text area an ID. your message. Now, the text area element does not need a type attribute because it is its own unique element, text area. And finally, the name will be your message. So now if we save and refresh, we can see that there is a much larger box than the traditional text input that we've seen in earlier examples. So now users can begin typing their custom message, and if they hit enter or return on their keyboard, they can even go down to second and third and fourth and fifth lines. So the text area element is how we receive a paragraph, or actually multiple paragraphs of text. And that will conclude this particular lesson. Let's review what we've learned. We learned that there are different input types for receiving different types of data. So if we're receiving a telephone number, we should use a special type for that. If we're receiving an email address, we should use a special type for that. And finally, we learned that when we want to receive multiple lines of text, we can use the text area element. In our next lesson, we will learn that we don't always want our users to manually type in data. Sometimes we want them to choose between a predetermined set of options. I'll see you in the next lesson.